How are we doing today, folks? Good. All right. That's good to hear. So I come trepidatiously because I have an announcement to make that nobody wants to hear. I will not be handing the exams back today. I promise I have my reasons, okay? And before you go storming off and saying, all right, evaluation's going down the hill. No, I promise I have my reasons. So keep in mind this all emanates from the fact that I did give you the option of taking the exam on Wednesday or Friday. Back when we were taking the exam just on Wednesday, we were going to review it on Friday. And at that time, I assumed everybody who was not able to take the exam would not be available because they were gone out of town until this week. All right. Situation has changed now because we took the exam on Wednesday, increments on Wednesday and Friday. Those 4 people who were still out of town last week or unavailable last week still have not taken the exam. So the option was to review the exam today and make those 4 people get up and leave the room, or to do the exam or to wait till the exam. They're all going to take it before Wednesday and then review the exam on Wednesday afternoon. I made the call to say that I was going to wait till the exam on Wednesday afternoon. And I realize that sucks. Everybody is going to be like saying, I'm so eager. I want to know what the exam looks like. I get that. I sincerely understand. I don't generally do that. In fact, I pride myself on how quickly I turn around my exams. It's usually the next class period. So waiting a week is just kind of like, I'm aghast at doing that. But I thought it would be much more efficient for us as a class to go through the exam together with everybody having completed the exam together. All right. So I will make this promise to you. And I was guaranteed to one person I was talking to about this that I would make this promise. Okay. I'm going to do this one time. I will not do this again for the rest of the semester, barring any extreme circumstances. Like if I'm in the hospital, there's no guarantees, okay? But I'm going to do this one time, make this judgment call to do it like one time, and basically say that this will be the only time that happens, and probably be the only time that happens in the career of any time you take classes with me. That's classes you took with me in AIS, take for this course. I guess I shouldn't say that because last semester, my class that took the auditing exam, they took it on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving break. I gave them off the Friday of Thanksgiving break. They had to wait for a week and a half before they actually got their results back in. So, so maybe I'm not as good about doing that as again. I'm going to do my best. I apologize, but I hope that I will accept my apology for not turning the exams. I think it's well warranted and justified given the people have not sit for the exams, and I hope you'll forgive me. If there is a sincere lack of forgiveness, and if you feel like that you cannot forgive me this, please just contact me and let me know. Okay. Just so I can get that weight off my chest, otherwise I'm just going to assume forgiveness is in there. Actually, don't contact me. Just, I'm going to assume everybody's going to forgive me and everybody's going to be cool with it. If you're not cool with it, I don't know, tell John. Okay. Yeah. We'll just, yeah. You can bear that burden for me, John. How's that? All right, cool. So real quick before we get started on chapter 6, and I'll give you some schedule updates here in just a second. But as far as the end of semester project goes, we are doing an end of semester project in groups. We've got 22 people in this class. When I want to do it in 4 groups. So we're talking about groups of 5 or 6. So far, we haven't really talked about this, but I would like to get the groups resolved before we depart for spring break. So please start thinking about people you want to work with. It's a little bit more flexible with larger groups, but groups of 5 or 6 with 4 people. I think groups are 5 or 6, 4 groups of that should be easy to accommodate. So 2 groups of 5, 2 groups of 6. I think that's the way the math works out. If you have no preference whatsoever, if you don't care about who you're going to group with, don't worry about it. I will get you assigned to a group. If you have partial preferences, that's fine. You can say, I want to be in the group with these 3 people. As always, please make sure that the people that you ask to be in a group or you want to be in a group with, you've asked them beforehand. I had an unfortunate incident several years ago where one young lady was assigned to 3 different groups. And so I had to say, oh, did everybody agree to be in a group with you? I was like, no, these other people just said that they wanted to be in a group with me and didn't ever ask. So that was a really awkward conversation to have. So please make sure you confirm with the other people they want to be in a group with you. And if they tell you to your face, yeah, I want to be in a group with you, and then come to me behind my back and say, I don't want to be in a group with this person, I will make up some excuse for you. Okay, make up some excuse. As far as this week goes, let's go ahead and make the plan. So today we're going to do full chapter 6. We're going to get through the first part of the lecture. Wednesday, we have a discussion assignment for Wednesday. I'm going to replace that discussion with our exam review. I would like to still go over the discussion assignment though, so please make sure you do the reading for the discussion. I will try to pigeonhole that into our discussion on Friday. It's going to be the extension of our cost case. Does everybody remember costs from chapter 4? The fraud of the lady who stole 34 million of $70 million. We're going to talk about internal controls in place in the company. I will try to throw that in on Friday as part of our homework review. So just don't let that go. Just make sure you read through the case, and we'll try to find time for it. Probably won't spend as much time. We're also going to actually be talking about Dixon, Illinois, which I mentioned at the beginning of the semester, was that show on Hulu, Scam Goddess. They actually highlighted Dixon, Illinois recently. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. There's a lot to that as well. But yeah, a lot to look forward to because we're starting internal controls. And unlike AIS, when I was buying you all Red Bull to keep you awake, this internal control is exciting, okay? Because we're going to be talking about internal control from the perspective of the auditor. So everybody in this room should understand the idea about internal control. Controls are a response to a risk, okay? And there's a few things that I kind of do in preparation for this. So has anybody ever been to New York, the island of Manhattan, or the island of Manhattan have been there? So yeah, so a few people have been there. Have you seen TV shows with New York, like Seinfeld and stuff like that? So if you ever notice in the restaurants in those TV shows, they usually have in the front window, there's a letter, usually an A, sometimes something lower than an A, but usually an A that's in the front window. Does anybody know what those letters in the front windows of New York restaurants indicate? So those are health screenings. So basically, health and sanitation screenings that they're supposed to prepare for the restaurants in New York. And unlike restaurants elsewhere in the country, they actually have to display the results of their health screenings to the world. So okay, basically this place is sanitary and it's been well vetted. Everything is good. You will not get sick, or at least we don't think you'll get sick when you eat here. Okay, really adequate form of communication. And I think that's something important to note. Can this be relevant to people who are in the organization itself, in the restaurant? Yes, okay, because they have to maintain that. But is it also relevant to people outside of the organization? Yes, that's information is communicated to people outside the organization to say, hey, you really will enjoy eating here because we won't make you sick. The taste of the food, that's secondary, but we promise we won't make you sick, all right? So that's kind of how I frame internal controls. And trust me when I say that we'll get into a little bit more depth on that here in just a little bit. But I've got a lot to say with internal controls, and it goes beyond what you already know from AIS. So let's talk a little bit about something that you should be familiar with already from internal controls and AIS, and it has to do with the COSO framework. So everybody remember back in AIS said, don't forget this. This will be coming back, I promise. I said we're going to be visiting it again. Yes. I want to talk a little bit about the history of COSO framework because it's fascinating. Okay, it's fascinating. So you can actually go to COSO.org and you can actually see it's Committee on Sponsoring Organizations. And the story behind this is this a company, this organization, it's not a company, it's an organization. It was founded in 1985 to sponsor the Treadway Commission. And the Treadway Commission is the vernacular for the National Commission of Fraudulent Financial Reporting. This isn't many on the exam, by the way. This is just for reference. So basically, the Treadway Commission was trying to determine what are some ways that we can do a better job as accountants and auditors of addressing issues in fraudulent financial reporting, because this is starting to become a problem with the prominence of reliance on financial reporting by external stakeholders. Keep in mind, this is one of the periods of time where Wall Street was seeing a massive boom, and a lot more focus on information and financial reporting was prominent. And so this was an area where a lot of fraud was going on, and they were saying, how can we curtail this? And you know what their answer was? Better internal controls. Better internal controls. So the COSO internal control integrated framework was created at this time. Now I see the rapt contemplation in your eyes, and you're just saying, Dr. Barnes, I just have one question for you. It says Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. What are these organizations? And the answer is, I'm glad you asked. Okay. So you can actually go to the website and it talks about these. And some of these you're probably familiar with. The American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, Financial Executives International, Institute of International Auditors, and National Association of Accountants. So that's what they were called at the time. Now they're called the Institute of Management Accountants, which, interesting history, my father was a vice president of the National Association of Accountants before they became the IMA. So, and that actually tells a little bit about story of why I became an accountant. I was misled, by the way, because whenever I went on an AA, we had these summer trips with an AA with my father. We went to like really exotic places like Hawaii and went to Washington, D.C. and Houston. And we had just like these fantastic vacation experiences. And I thought that's what being an accountant was like. This is cool. This is what I want to do for my career. Yeah, I was completely and totally misled about what being an accountant was to that. There's also this one, the American Accounting Association. This is actually the academic branch of accounting. This is what I'm a part of, the American Accounting Association. I'm actually part of both this and the AICPA, but kind of all the big administrative groups with respect to accounting, they're all part of the Committee on Sponsoring Organizations. All right, so that's for a little bit of background on COSO, stuff that you may not have wanted to know, but now you know, okay? And as the G.I. Joe books say, knowing is half the battle. So that's only funny if you grew up in the 1980s, actually. So yeah, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the COSO Internal Control Integrated Framework. Internal controls should be designed to provide confidence about the achievement of the entity's objectives. All right, that's it. That's basically all we're going to learn. So I guess we do have time for the exam review. No, we got a lot to go into with respect to that. So let's go ahead and delineate a few important things. What would be management's responsibility with respect to internal controls? Would you say that those are separate from auditor's responsibilities? The answer is yes. We've already talked about that. We talked about manager's responsibility and auditor's responsibility with respect to financial statements, but with respect to internal controls, management is responsible for the design and maintenance of internal controls. You might want to throw in, if you're taking notes here, you might want to throw in the word implementation as well. Design, implementation, and maintenance. Those are kind of the key words in this area. What is the auditor's responsibility? Oh, by the way, this is according to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, Section 404. And so that's one of the keys. What is the auditor responsible for? Auditor is responsible for understanding and assessing the performance of internal controls. And we're going to talk about each of those perspectives here in just a little bit because they are a little bit different. Understanding is mandatory. Assessment is in most cases required, but not always mandatory, not always required. All right, so we start talking about the nature of controls. Controls can be characterized in a number of different ways. So these are the objectives of the COSO framework, which we're going to go into in a little bit more detail. Does everybody remember the COSO cube? We discussed this back in AIS and say, yeah, it looks like a Rubik's Cube. And what would happen if you mix it up? Chaos would ensue if you mixed it up, okay? But it does tell some really important stories, okay? We're going to talk about this front side first, which is something you all should know and love. And again, if you forgot it from AIS, trust me when I say you will remember it quickly and you will remember it harshly because it's really important. We talk about this side here, the right side. That's actually the level at which controls operate. This is something that we're not going to go into a lot of depth about, but it's always important to remember. Controls operate at different levels within the organization. And so if we're talking about just simply a control that's in place at like a store, for example, Taco Bell, we've talked about the nature of controls at Taco Bell. They can't open a cash register unless a transaction occurs. That's a control. That's an entity, or not entity level, that's a function level control, okay? So within the store itself, or actually maybe an operating, no, it would be a function level control. That'd be the cashier control, all right? When we talk about entity level, those are much higher. Those are going to focus on the entity as a whole. So something like a code of conduct would be an example of control at that level. But it's important to note, controls can operate throughout the entity at different levels. They're all considered to be those addressing risks within the organization. We're going to talk a lot more about entity level controls when we get to chapter 7. We're going to get into a little bit more detail. But for right now, I just want you to remember that controls permeate the organization at all levels. And then we have this thing up here, the top of the COSO cube, which are the objectives. So controls basically hit 3 parts of an organization. They hit the reliability of financial reporting, the effectiveness and efficiency of operations, and compliance with laws and regulations. Or as I like to shorthand, I like to say reporting, operations, compliance. That's the easy way to remember it. And that's basically what the COSO cube tells us right here. Now, this is a little bit of a precursor. But when we talked about this back in AIS, I said all of these are important. The accounting information system has to address all of these in turn. I'm not going to change my tune. I'm not going to change my function in that. I'm going to say all these functions are still important, or all these objectives, I should say. All these objectives are still important. But as auditors, we are far more concerned about one area of objectives than others. Can anybody guess which one we would be most concerned about as auditors? So reporting's operation or compliance. Which do you think is the most important to auditors? Reporting, yes. Okay. And we're going to see that in the notes in a second, which makes sense because we're concerned about the accuracy of financial statements, and financial statements are generated as part of the reporting function. So that's the auditor's responsibility in that regard. So as we're talking about here, Those most relevant internal controls in a financial statement audit are those contribute to the reliability, timeliness, and transparency of external financial reporting, just as we talked about. And so these controls are relevant to audit because they help to prevent or detect and correct material misstatements in entities' financial statements. So this is something I just introduced to my AIS students today, and I'm reintroducing to you all who have had AIS. Remember, the controls can generally be characterized as either preventative in nature or detective and corrective in nature. So controls stop something from happening, or if something bad happens, they detect the problem and fix it. And those are paired together, all right? Now, we're going to spoil this to talking a little bit about Chapter 7. External auditors for large public companies are required to express an opinion as to the effectiveness of the client's internal controls over financial reporting. So we're going to talk about that more in Chapter 7 because that's going to be focused on that particular area. So our discussion for today and this week will be controls in general. Chapter 7 is going to specifically talk about controls within that one objective area and what responsibilities we have as auditors. This is really important for those of you who will be working on public companies as auditors in the future, because you'll be subject to those rules. And what we're going to find is the rules over the controls in this area are a lot more stringent, a lot more severe, and require a lot more thought put into them. But let's go ahead and do a review. All right. Internal control is defined by the COSO frameworks consisting of 5 components. How many people feel they remember these from AIS? Dr. Barnes, you did such a great job of teaching there. I could spout them verbatim and define all of them right now. Anybody in that boat? Nobody in that boat? Okay. Well, fortunately, I can. Okay. So let's go ahead and go through these. Now, I want to reiterate, this is something that I think everybody in this room is on board with. The COSO framework, the components are composed of five components. Within those 5 components, there are 17 principles relating to internal controls. I'm not going to hold you accountable for those 17 principles, but I will hold you accountable for all 5 of these components at a very, very detailed level. So you do need to know these really well. I would say that for everything that you had to remember them back in 367, it is far more prominent in here because we're going to go and drill a lot more in depth into this. So first one is going to be right at the top, okay? How the management approaches internal controls in the organization. Does anybody remember what that's called? Or you can look at the slides, it's also on there. It's control environment, okay? I think this is the most important component of internal control out of the 5. This basically defines whether the organization takes control seriously. If management takes it seriously, if management actually has a good environment for reporting and internal controls, then the organization as a whole will do well. If management's kind of like, don't care, then it's not going to be effective, all right? Then we note that in order for controls to work, we have to be able to identify what controls have to be able to address. Because remember, controls are a response to a risk. So we need to know what the risks are. That's entities risk assessment, okay? Then we've got our control activities. The control activities are basically the controls themselves. Then we have information and communication. That's basically dictating what the environment of the organization looks like and whose responsibilities are where. And then we have monitoring, which is follow-up. I realized I didn't want to go too much in depth in this because I've got slides for each of these. So what do you say we take a look at those? All right. These are going to look very familiar because I did draft my AIS slides from these original ones that I created in auditing. But if these look familiar, yeah, I take them together. Control environment sets the tone of organization and influences the control consciousness of people. The importance of control in an entity is reflected by the overall attitude, awareness, and actions of the board of directors, management, and owners regarding internal control. The people who are the stakeholders at the top, okay? The people who influence those decisions. Think about this. If you came into the room and say, Dr. Barnes, is it possible that I could bring a note card for the next exam because I was really worried about it? I just write down some notes in there. I say, I appreciate that, but I really think that's walking the line. Please do not read new note cards. I do consider that cheating. That's a very clear message that I take cheating very seriously in this course, okay? Contrast that to you ask me the same question, can I bring a note card in, just write down my notes? I'm like, whatever. Those are 2 different signals. Can we agree? Yeah, that's control environment. That's basically the tone that I'm setting for this particular course is kind of the tone that's set for an organization. Next, we have entities risk assessment. Identifies and responds to business risks. That's basically what we have to do in order to make controls. So in order to be able to understand what controls need to be in place, we have to know what the risks are. That's identifying the risks, estimating their significance, assessing the likelihood of occurrence, and deciding on how to manage those risks. This is the process in which we create new controls within the organization. Process by which we create new controls in the organization. All right, moving on past this, we have control activities. Control activities are the policies and procedures that help ensure that management's directives are carried out and implemented to address risks identified in a risk assessment process. So this is where we say, we know what the risks are. Let's create some controls to address those. So what are some examples of these? Approvals, authorizations, verifications, reconciliations. We talked about that briefly back in 367. Remember those bank reconciliations you did back in 302? You had to do those bank reconciliations. What was the purpose of that? Just to show that you could actually make numbers balance and look correct? Isn't that the best feeling in the world when you get the bank balance and the book balance to settle out to one another? Just kind of like all those adjustments like out. It feels great. Like you're 3 cents off. That's just like, it's agony. It's absolute agony. Wouldn't you guys agree? 3 cents is enough to create agony. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Couldn't resist. Anyway, yeah, making sure that reconciliation works out. That's just the best feeling in the world. Okay. But what's the purpose of the reconciliation? It's trying to make sure that everything is adequate, that we make sure we can actually address any problems as they come up, and it's a form of control in that regard. Reviews of operating performance. So anybody who had a part-time job here? I think I asked this question at AIS, but I'm going to ask it again. He sit you down and said, you're doing a great job here. We're going to give you a 50-cent per hour raise. All right. What are they trying to do there? Are they just trying to give you more money? No, they're trying to review and make sure that you're doing the work that they hired you to do. If you're not doing the job, then they should get rid of you, because that's part of the responsibility there. So this is a control here, making sure that you're addressing the issue areas that they hired you to do. And then segregation of duties. By the way, does everybody remember this from 367? You're going to get so sick of this in this course. I'm going to tell you right now. I'm going to drill this into your head. So I got a picture of a car there. CAR. What does CAR stand for? Custody, authorization, recording, custody of assets, authorization of transactions, and recording of transactions. These are 3 areas that, according to the Institute of Internal Auditors, that need to be separated in responsibility areas and process areas in order to avoid misstatements from occurring. So very, very simple example. If we think about inventory, we do not want somebody working in the warehouse to all have access to the inventory records. Why? They could mess with the inventory records and steal inventory and get away with it. Okay. So we want to make sure that that custody and recording function are separated out. Trust me when I say, when we get to the business process areas, we're going to spend a lot of time on this concept. Okay. This is one of the most important controls that can exist in an organization. And we're going to talk about not only what happens when those controls are present, what the risks are, but how can we address those and make sure that custody, authorization, recording are always separated, or if they're not, what we need to do as auditors to follow up on. So yeah, this is one of my favorite controls to talk about. Again, if you enjoyed it, if you enjoyed talking about it in AIS, the great news is we're going to talk about a lot more in this course. If you hated it, well, I'm sorry. That's all I can tell you, because this a really important control. All right. One thing to note about control activities. Control activities specify the control's creation. So we create a control in response to a risk. Is that sufficient by itself? Can I just put a control in place and say we're done? What happens if I put a control in place and nobody bothers to use it? Okay. So I say, all right, keep your eyes on your own exam. Okay, I want to make sure that everybody's not focused on that, and you're not looking at everybody else. And then you all hear that, and you're just kind of like, it's just Dr. Barnes. And start looking at everybody's exam and say, oh, I got that question wrong. Let me change my answer. Okay. Does a control work if everybody ignores it? No. So this is going to be focused on what we call the design of internal controls. This area here, control activities. We also need to know the controls are operating effectively. So we want to focus on operating effectiveness as well. The next 2 areas will address that particular part. So what are we going to be focused on with respect to operating effectiveness? The first is going to be information and communication. It's the acquisition, use, and sharing of relevant, high-quality information from both internal and external sources. It's necessary to support the functioning of internal controls. Now, first part of this is really, really easy. If you're in an organization and your job responsibilities are not well defined, can you do your job effectively? No. Can you follow the controls that you're supposed to be following, or can you follow your responsibilities very well if you don't have clearly defined lines of responsibility? No. So it's really important for an organization to function properly that everybody has their roles and they have well-defined parameters for those roles. If everybody has that, then controls within an organization should be clearly delineated as well. Who's responsible for custody of assets? Who's responsible for recording of transactions? Who's responsible for authorization of transactions? Defining both what you can and cannot do in your job responsibility. That's something that's really, really critical. But the last part is a little bit suspect. Like, well, what about external sources? Why is that important? Consider the analogy that I use for class, okay? Remember at the very beginning of the semester, I talked about Seabreeze, my favorite place to eat, which I had a cheeseburger there last night, which is why I'm in such a good mood, okay? But what did I say happened on that cheeseburger when I was using that my visceral example? It got sneezed on. It got sneezed on. It was the sneeze burger, okay? All right. And I said that really kind of defeats the purpose of the cheeseburger tasting good. I'm never going to eat that cheeseburger because I personally don't like eating other people's. Well, you know. Anyway, I don't think that's a very healthy situation. The communication is important because we're going to need to understand the process by which transactions occur within organizations, not just what the end result of those are. The way that we evaluate this externally is we have external signaling, external communication. So here's an example of the letters that go up in those restaurants back in New York. Remember I was saying they put letter grades up there? Is that signaling something to external participants? Yes, it's saying, look, our controls are effective within this organization. You can eat here and it's good, it's nice and sanitary. It's really well done, all right? The final one is going to be also related to operating effectiveness controls, but this more has to do with updates for the future. As we know, risks change, okay? Think about 2 weeks ago when it was 50 degrees outside. Would you say that your risk profile for walking to campus was a little bit different than walking in today? Yeah, you had to be a little bit more careful on your walk today because there's a lot of wetness on the ground, okay? Frozen water that's falling from the sky that's making it a little bit more hazardous, which by the way, kudos to everybody showing up. It's like a 22 out of 22. So, yeah, I appreciate your effort and devotion to that. And I came and showing that appreciation by not bringing your exams to you. So I apologize for that. Yeah, that's just a punch in the gut right there. So yeah, we know risks change. We have to be able to evolve to those risks. This is going to be considered monitoring. So we want to assess the internal control quality of internal control of performance over time. We should continuously monitor controls to determine whether they're operating effectively. If they are not, if risks change, we need to be willing to address those. So if the controls are not operating effectively, we need to update controls as necessary. Or if risks change that we think that are going to affect the operation of controls, we need to update controls as well. Interesting example. Something that occurred it's almost hard to believe, almost 5 years ago now. 5 years ago, March, something really profound happened on campus. I know this is before any of you all were here. I remember it well. I was just going on teaching my way. I was like, and then all of a sudden, Dr. Caden says, don't come back to campus. Didn't tell me that. She told all the students that, okay? Actually, it was more of a mandate across the Truman State said, don't come back to campus. What am I talking about? COVID, yeah, you all had to experience that too. You probably had to go, you were in school and in high school and probably it's like saying, yeah, don't come back to school. You had to learn online. Why? Because the risks changed pretty substantially because we had this big epidemic that was going on across the planet, and they wanted to make sure that we address that risk properly. So they did. They changed the complete and total environment of the operations of the organization, and we had all of our students attending classes online, which was a really interesting time, by the way. I was well adept for it because I taught online before. I want to tell you right now, you see some of the older instructors like Steve Smith and Alan Davis trying to adapt to that. Yeah, that was just, that was craziness right there. Okay, what is a webcam? What does that mean? What is that word that you just said? Yeah, trying to teach them how to use Zoom. That was fun. That was fun. Yeah. Anyway, not a fun time in general, but some interesting tidbits I can talk about. Yeah. So we know that things change over time. We know that we want to make sure that we address that. So the thing is that I've been talking now for almost 30 minutes, and I have not taught you anything that you did not already know about controls. This is just a reiteration of what you know. So let's go ahead and talk about something that's really important. Let's talk about something that I call, sorry, there's the summary, by the way. So I'm not going to go through this. We've already gone through this in much detail. But what I do want to talk about is I want to talk about something called the controls sequence. Now, this is my terminology. Okay, this is not something you'll find in the book, but I think it's extremely important to understand and differentiate between how this course is different from AIS. So there's a couple of really important distinctions. All you remember from AIS is that risks exist, and controls respond to risk. All right. That was basically the prominence of controls back then. You also knew the COSO framework, but for the most part, the relationship between risk and control was your independent understanding. We're going to make that richer now. This is what the control sequence talks about. First of all, we still got our risks. Okay, we still got our organizational risks. As auditors, how do we characterize risks in an organization? What are those things that we learned back in chapter 5? Completeness, existence, occurrence, VAA. What were those things that we learned back in chapter 5 that characterize risk in an organization? Management assertions, okay? What we're going to be doing from this point forward is every time we identify risk, we're going to characterize that according to the assertions that are represented by management within the financial reports or their operations. We're going to characterize according to risk. So there's a relationship between risks and management assertion, which makes sense because, like, say something like inventory was misreported, fictitious inventory was reported. Like, so if I say fictitious inventory, how would I characterize that? That's existence occurrence. There's no actual inventory, so it's a reporting associated with existence occurrence. That's how we're going to characterize every risk in this course. We know that a control is a response to a risk. So effectively, a control is a response to an assertion that we think is a problem. So we still got that relationship between risk and control, but moving further, now as auditors, we have a responsibility for testing the control, for determining, all right, you say the control is in place, is it designed properly, and does it operate effectively? We're going to test the control, so we have a responsibility for going into depth a little bit further. We will see this sequence diagram a lot through the rest of this course, but this is kind of the moving forward, the iteration that we're going to be seeing moving forward is understanding what do we mean by tests of controls? All right, and this is where that step is moving into. All right, so recall that preliminary assessment of control risk is developed during the risk assessment process, and our audit strategy is based on the auditor's understanding and reliance on entity's control. Now, there's an important concept here, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later on. We're going to just delineate between the concept of assess control risk and achieve control risk. Assess control risk is basically saying, this is what we think control risk is before we've tested any controls. Achieve control risk will be what control risk is actually assessed at after we've completed all of our testing. The reason I make this determination or to make this distinction is sometimes in the book, they refer to achieve control risk as assess control risk, but they talk about it post-assessment. It's a little bit fuzzy. They're not really good about making that distinction. I will try to always make sure I'm very clear about that distinction. When I say control risk before the fact, it's assess control risk after controls have been tested. That's going to be our achieved control risk. Now, there's a subtle distinction, but a really important one to make. The reason why is because, remember, what we set control risk at dictates the course of the rest of the audit, dictates the testing that we're going to be doing during substantive phases. So we need to be very, very clear about what the level of that is. Now, in general, our examples that we're going to be talking about in this course are going to focus on how do we test controls, which makes sense because this is a class that's focused on public company audits. And it would really be pointless for me to say, let's talk about controls and to say, we don't test those, okay? So for the purpose of the chapter, we need to say test the controls. That being said, an auditor generally has two approaches they can take with respect to controls within a certain process area. So the first of these is basically saying, look, we don't want to test any of the controls. We don't think that it would be worthwhile for us to test controls. This is called to be a substantive strategy. Now, for most of our examples in this course, this will not exist. We will not have a substantive strategy. But it basically says the auditors decided not to rely on any of these controls. Instead, use substantive procedures as the main source of evidence about the assertions in the financial statements. Now, there's a few notes here that I want to make, okay? The first of these is that regardless of whether we decide to test controls for a client, we as auditors always, 100% of the time, mandatory, no matter what, have to gain a diligent understanding of the internal controls in an entity. We don't necessarily always have to test them, but we always have to have an understanding of what controls are in place. So the understanding is mandatory, okay? Secondly, the question comes up, does this mean that we can do substantive strategy for the entire audit, or can we only do substantive strategy for portions of the audit? And the answer for both of those is yes, okay? In some audits, we could defer not to do controls testing at all. Like if I was testing Greek Corner Euros down the street, I don't think they have a controls infrastructure whatsoever, okay? So my audit would focus exclusively on substantive procedures for the entire audit. If I was like doing something like Amazon, is it possible that I would do substantive strategy? Not for the entire audit by any means, but there's portions of the financial statements I might employ a substantive strategy. We'll talk about when a substantive strategy is most appropriate when we get to the business processes. But for right now, you should just keep in mind is that this is always an option to an auditor. So auditor may decide to follow substantive strategy for all assertions, some of all assertions because of one of the following factors. The implemented controls do not pertain to the assertion the auditor is considering. So we look at the controls the client has in place. Those do not address the risk that we're mostly concerned about in that area. So it's pointless to test the controls because we're more concerned about other areas, other assertions within that area. The implemented controls are assessed as ineffective. We gain our understanding of controls and we look at them. We say, these controls are garbage. Okay. We're in the years 2025 and this company is still using BASIC. Okay. Has anybody ever seen BASIC on a computer, by the way? That's what I programmed in back in the 1980s. All right. So yeah, not Visual Basic, just BASIC, flat BASIC. Okay. So some computer programming language you've never heard of. All right. Testing the operating effectiveness of controls would be inefficient. I want you to circle that one. That is our primary reason, the one that we most run into when we talk about substantive procedures. Usually we say it would be less effective use of our time to test controls rather than just using a substantive strategy. That is usually the most common scenario when that comes up. All right. I promise that we're going to come back to that. So if the first one is a substantive strategy, because we do substantive procedures, and we decide not to rely on internal controls, the second one must have to do with something about relying on internal controls. And you are correct. That is a reliance strategy. A reliance strategy means that auditor intends to rely on the entities and controls. So the auditor plans to perform tests of controls to use the test results to determine the achieved level of control risk. In other words, we decide that we want to set control risk at some other level than high. And I forgot to mention that if we use a substantive strategy in an area, control risk will always 100% of the time be high. We can't set it anything lower because we did not test controls. So substantive strategy equals high control risk. You should probably make a note of that. But let's say that we think the controls have a possibility of making control risk something lower than high. So if we say control risk is moderate, then we may get out of some work as auditors, which would be great for us. What does that mean? It means that we're using a reliance strategy. And that if we rely on clients' controls, we have to test those controls. So reliance strategy means we're always going to test the controls. That does not mean that control risk will always be lower than high. It means that we're trying to get control risk to be less than high. But in some scenarios, controls may just be bad, and we have to still set control risk at high. But a reliance strategy always requires that we test controls and to try to determine what the actual level of control risk is. Now, what happens if the audit or the test results indicate the achieved level of control risk is higher than planned? Okay, so let's assume that we test or we're getting ready to go into controls. We say we're going to use a reliance strategy. I'm excited about a reliance strategy, and I really want to rely on the client's controls because I believe the controls are going to be at least moderately helpful. And so I set my control risk, my assessed level control risk is medium or moderate. So then I walk in and I test my controls or test their controls and I say, wow, these controls are just hot garbage. All right. I thought these controls are going to be good. They're not working at all. They're completely ineffective in this area. I now have to set control risk at high. What does that mean about for us for our audit work later on? We have less work or more work to do? More work. Think about it logically, okay? If the controls are bad, means that we probably have to do more testing to adapt for that. But we already have the function. We already know about the relationships here. So remember, this is part of the audit risk model, okay? Control risk is high. So that means risk of material misstatement is likely high. Risk of material misstatement is high. Detection risk is low. That means we have low tolerance for risk. We don't like low tolerance for risk. So that means a lot of work, okay? What about if the test of control support the plan level control risk, okay? So let's say I'm going into a client and I say, I have worked on this client before. They have got the most immaculate controls ever. I would love to have these controls in my personal life. They wouldn't be applicable, but I would love to have these controls, all right? So I'm going to set my assessed level control risk and I test controls. And in fact, the assessed level control risk keeps it at low, okay? So I can keep my assessed level control risk low. If control risk is low, what does that mean about risk of material misstatement? This is a trick question. See if you guys remember me talking about this back in chapter 4. So some people are going to say it depends, and I say no, it doesn't. Okay, no, it doesn't. Okay, but by the way, thank you for using it depends. It makes me feel wanted. All right, so yeah, What do we know about control risk with respect to risk and material misstatement? The risk and material misstatement is predicated on what is the lowest level of inherent risk or control risk. If I know control risk is low, risk and material misstatement always has to be low, okay? Doesn't matter what inherent risk is, control risk is low, so risk and material misstatement is low. Detection risk is high, okay? High detection risk means that we have to do more or less work. Less work. So controls are great. We walk in and we say, man, this is going to be an easy audit, okay? It means I can roll up my sleeves and I can be done by the end of the day. I wish that was the case, but maybe by the end of the week, okay? So that would be the goal there. That would be the dream. So reliance strategy, it's important to note. When we talk about a reliance strategy always involves the auditors testing internal controls in the area that we plan on relying on them. The goal of that testing is to try to make control risk as low as possible, because that means that we do less work later on. Just like substantive strategy, we're going to evaluate the context and we would generally use this reliance strategy. I will kind of give you a spoiler for that right now. Usually in high operational areas where there's a lot of transactions, that's where we're going to be focusing more on test of controls. Substantive strategy usually occurs in areas that do not have a large volume of transactions, low volume, low transaction areas. But we'll see a lot more of that when we get to the business process areas. All right, moving on. So auditor standards require the auditor to obtain an understanding of each of the 5 components of internal control to plan the audit. So what were those components again? What was the one at the top? 5 components of internal control. We just talked about them. My favorite thing to talk about, something I told you would be tested about. You need to remember. Control environment. Yes. Okay. So then once we've established the control environment, we need to assess risk, entities risk assessment. What do we do to respond to risk? What is that third step called? Control activities. Control activities relate to design or operation of control? Design of control. What relates to operation of control? What's the 4th step? Information communication, making sure everybody in the organization and externally know what their role in the controls are. Another one that deals with operating effectiveness is the 5th step. That's changing and adapting to new changes in the environment. What's that one called? Monitoring. Yes. So please make sure you remember all of those, okay? Because those are all really important. We have to understand each of the 5 components of internal control to plan the audit. What do we use this knowledge for? Identifying the types of potential misstatement. So one of the very first things we should know is if we know what the risk is, we should be able to understand what types of misstatement can occur, okay? If I'm talking about inventory and I'm saying my management assertion that I'm concerned about with inventory's existence, what type of a misstatement can occur here? I could say the client could overreport their ending inventory. What would that result be if they overreport ending inventory? Makes cost of goods sold go up or down? Cost of goods sold goes down, and that makes expenses go down. So what happens to income? Yeah, it's a common fraud scheme when ending inventory is overreported. We want to make sure all inventory that's on the balance sheet actually exists. That's a really critical assertion in that area. That's one of the risks that we worry about. We want to pinpoint the factors that affect the risk and material misstatement. So what is it that's going to affect our inherent risk and control risk so we can make a proper assessment of those and hopefully achieve something that's going to be lower than the highest level. And then design our test of controls and substantive procedures. So understand what it is that we need to test as part of controls testing and what our follow-up tests are going to be to gain our final levels of assurance. All right. So the last thing we're going to talk about, actually one of the few of the last things we're going to talk about, pretty close to the last things we're going to talk about, is controls are great, okay? Controls are great. What was the quote that I used several years ago back during the COVID pandemic? Quote, controls are quite simply the best thing ever, okay? And that's an actual quote for me. That's an actual quote. But if you think about it, if you don't have controls in your life, you're just basically in a lot of trouble. You're just going to walk into traffic and do stuff like that. We can't have a society that has no controls. Controls are really important. But the effectiveness of any internal control system is subject to certain inherent limitations. Basically, what this means is no matter how well we design controls cannot address every possible scenario. What are these 3 inherent limitations, you may be asking? This is something that I like to talk about because I'm very fond of talking about this particular area. First of these is called management override of internal control. Management override of internal control. That sounds evil, right? You guys hear management override, you think like, well, maybe we should make it so managers can't override internal controls. Is that where you're on? Yeah, you're with me on that? Okay. All right, I want to walk through a scenario with you. Okay. Let's say after class here, because I like to talk about cheeseburgers so much, you decide to jaunt over to Taco Bell to get some food, okay? And so you order your Mexican pizza, which last time I checked was like $5.50. Okay. Order a Mexican pizza, hand them a $20 bill. They take your $20 bill, put it in the register and close the register. You guys okay with that? No, what's happened? They have not given you your change back. Okay. And so you say, I'm due $14.50 in change. And they're like, oh, you're right. I forgot to give you change. Sorry about that. Well, that's unfortunate. I can't open the register without a transaction taking place. So I guess you're just out of luck. Are you going to be okay with that? Saying, oh, well, it would violate internal controls. So yeah, that's cool. You can go ahead and take my $14.50. Dr. Barnes taught me better than that. What are you going to say? You're going to say, can you get a manager to unlock the register so you can give me your change? Is that an override of an internal control? It is. Is it a necessary override of internal control? It is. Override of internal control is necessary in some scenarios, and that's an easy visual example of those. So that's one possibility. Overrides of internal controls render controls ineffective. Second one, personnel errors or mistakes. Do you guys think we can completely get rid of mistakes? Nope, probably not. My favorite example. How many of you heard about the McMillian scandal that occurred several years ago? It's like the Monopoly fraud. They had a big HBO documentary on it, just talked about it. So the entire source of that fraud was basically a security chief who had the custody of the game pieces. Basically, he transported them in a sealed envelope, and the way that the sealed envelope worked is there was a specific seal that was put on there that he could not break without people knowing that the custody or that basically had been tampered with. So that was kind of the authorization mechanism. But unfortunately, the company made the seals. I think it was a company abroad, it's an international company. They mailed the seals directly to him. So now he not only had custody of the game pieces, but he also had possession of these seals, okay, which was their authorization, the function to make sure nobody unauthorized got into them. He basically broke the seal, took out the game pieces, replaced them with false game pieces, and then put the new seal back on with those seals that he was mailed. Okay. Simple mistake. Somebody just mailed the seals to the wrong person. And it caused this massive, massive fraud that created this documentary and this story that I get to tell now in class. Okay. It was just a mistake. That's all there was to it. We cannot avoid mistakes from happening. Final one, collusion. I'm going to give you guys some ideas here. Okay. Give you some ideas. Why can't collusion avoid controls? Because remember, collusion renders some of our controls inert. Remember I talked about pressure. I talked about segregation of duties, custody, authorization, recording. What if the three people who have those responsibility areas decide to work together to commit a fraud? Let's make it more simple, okay? Let's make it simple. On the next exam, Pender and John decide that they're gonna work together to bypass my control of watching them, okay? So I'm watching them like a hawk because I don't trust either of them, okay? And John says, Dr. Barnes, I have this question right here. And I look down to answer John's question, and Pender pulls out his notes, okay? It's like saying, aha, custody, authorization, recording. Yeah, okay. Okay, then John finishes talking to me, and Pender says, Dr. Barnes, I now have a question. So I go over and answer Pender's question, and John pulls out his notes. See what I mean about giving you guys ideas? Yeah, okay. So I can't stop that because that renders my control obsolete. My attention is diverted elsewhere. All right, certainly problematic. These three things mean the controls cannot be perfectly effective. No matter how hard we try, we can only hope for the best of controls. And for the last step, you're probably wondering, cube collusion, there we go. All right. What are the primary internal control weaknesses observed by certified fraud examiners? The answer's truth is a lot more simple than just trying to look for these complex answers. In most of the scenarios observed where controls failures occurred, it was a lack of internal controls. A third of I shouldn't say at most, what would that be, a plurality of situations, 1/3 of the situations, it was a lack of internal controls. And there's more simple explanations for why controls were not effective. There's override of existing controls, which that's a manager override we talked about, can be very dangerous, as well as lack of simple management review of controls. What we're going to see when we get to Dixon, Illinois, is there was almost no oversight of what Rita Crundwell was doing. Had there just been simple review of her processes and saying, oh, she knows what she's doing, instead of saying that, saying, let's take a look at what she's doing and see if she's doing everything properly, this might not have been such a big fraud. So yeah, with these areas right here, we're talking about almost 70% just in these three categories alone. And so that kind of gives you an idea of how simple a solution this should be and how problematic it's just not in many organizations. All right. We will be back on Wednesday. We will finish chapter 6. Once we're done with chapter 6, we will do the exam review or exam discussions. See you then.